Well, good morning, a couple of minutes early. This is Jonathan Albin and NycosRPG. Today's show, Creative Differences, is a conversation about role playing and is done with the idea of improving your game sessions and improving the communication that occurs between players and game masters. Gotta take care of a minor sound issue. Seems like my instrumental music always comes on too loud. So today we're going to be talking about the perfect recipe for role-playing excellence. And we did this video a few weeks ago, and it didn't go quite as well as I would have liked, and it was also a bit kind of happenstance and jerky, so we want to try to remove that this time around. So what we're going to be doing is we're looking at the various things that you can add to or amplify in your roleplay experience to make every session more exciting, more thrilling, and such. And so we're going to talk today about nuance, spice, and flavor. We have already talked at length about the multiple genres that you can roleplay and how many of them are understated. I did a video in particular on the overused tropes of roleplay games, and I also did one on the underdeveloped tropes. So if you get a chance to see those videos, I'll put links to them in the description. And the essence of this video is to talk not specifically about which genre, but what kinds of details that you can add that will add specialness or uniqueness to the session and thereby make it more perfect and more thrilling so that it becomes more memorable. After all, that's really kind of the objective, right? Is to create those adventures that the players sit around years later and go, you remember the time with the guy and the thing? And there's a whole story there too. I'll get back to that later in the episode. But we're going to talk about the ones that I have listed here, and while I didn't put them in any particular order, I'm going to follow the order here just to make the ability to mark the the chapters in the episode more clearly. I haven't done that before, so this will be a new experience putting in the chapter marks. But in the meantime, if you haven't been here before, welcome. I am Jonathan Albin, a game master with 50 years of game playing experience nonstop. I've been a GM since 1974, and I learned from my buddy's Grandpa Dave, who happened to be Dave Arneson, one of the guys that created Dungeons and Dragons, and I've been telling stories nonstop since then, an average of one time a week for that entirety. And so with that much experience, I want to offer you the opportunities to amplify your game mechanisms. With that many games and that many players, I think we've calculated something like 12,000 people are playing roleplay games, either because of me or in spite of me, depending on how you look at it. But today we're going to talk about the varieties of ways in which you can potentially endanger your players to give them the excitement that they're looking for. But we're also going to talk about some things that alter or change the conditions of the conflict during the conflict so that you can see some ways to make the story, if it's not thrilling enough, let's take it up kick it up a notch. Alrighty. So the first one we're going to talk about is poisons, venoms, and toxins. And I don't mean to always be bagging on Dungeons and Dragons as a mechanism, but one of the biggest challenges I've always had with role-playing is that the concept of injury by poison or venom or even just toxic materials in the environment have been lackluster. That almost all of them refer to an amount of damage being done per round or a reduction in overall maximum hit points, or it has something to do with the already abstract hit point pool, and to me that kind of feels flat. So within the realms of roleplay wherein I run the story, the effects of poisons, venoms, and toxins are varied by the source. So different creatures create different kinds of toxins that do different things. And while there have been happenstance occurrences in particular modules or adventures where Dungeons and Dragons rules have been used to greater or lesser extent to do what I envision, what I've done is simply made it so that each of the varieties of venins affect a different attribute of the persona. So maybe it makes you slightly slower, or makes you dizzy, or it causes you to doubt yourself, makes you look less attractive, and therefore affects your presence. Perhaps it has a adverse effect on your strength. You physically can't lift things like you could before. And if there are graduations in the intensity of those, then you have a really solid way to make each creature that has a venomous bite or a contact toxin makes those all that much more scary, because each encounter, each engagement with them might have a different effect until you get to know the species or whatever. The main reason to have these kind of situations, as was pointed out a long time ago, it's one thing to wound to quote kill a character. Nobody wants that. Everybody wants their persona to be able to persist, but nobody said anything about hindering, crippling, or maiming them. And the idea here is that the poisons, while they don't necessarily, since they are intended to be like a general threat, they don't tend to be lethal. They do tend to interfere with the activity of the persona and give them something really to have to think about. And so, therefore, going through the monster lists within the game system that you're running, look at the ways you can adjust the output of the potential danger of the poison, and maybe give each one of them a unique flavor. This variance will then give the players something to look forward to in their investigation, and in particular, those persona that are advocating for, if they're healers or medics or whatever, they're going to be more challenged with determining what they can use as an antidote. So therein is some fun. Second chapter. Sorry, the wrong finger. Second chapter. Disease and illness. And what we're going to talk about here is that in role-play games, fundamentally, with the advent of the paladin and clerics that can prevent or cure all disease, the disease and illness aspect of the medieval period, the fantasy periods, just goes away. There's no reason even to pursue it. Besides, from a purely mechanical basis, it would seem, why would you want to focus on or interact with such things as disease and illness? With the possible exception that I think it'd be kind of cool for your players to maybe find a cure for cancer, or discover a way to resolve issues of overcoming disease, overcoming a course of symptoms or whatever. And just as with the poisons and venoms, disease doesn't have to be a singular, pardon the phrase, death sentence. You can have diseases that are disfiguring or mind altering. There's a ton of different ways to go, but the nuance of having a world wherein disease does impact a certain percentage of the population does lend itself to players discovering their actual affinity for being helpful, and the desire to overcome these diseases can become something alive and interesting. The few times that I originally did the inclusion of disease and illnesses, I had my players actually stopping to breathe and saying, "Okay, we've got this is it was in that case it was a specific plague, wherein the whole point of the story was for the players to discover what was causing the plague." Man, something in my eye. Sorry. No, I'm not sad. I'm just a chunk of dust in my left eye. Ugh. But they were watching a disease progress through a community and trying to determine what was the vector for the illness. And that was really the story, was hunting down this particular species of rat and which ships it came from and why they were there and why it was so virulent and all of that. And so it was an exciting story in a vein that players don't normally engage with, and so it was definitely memorable. And the players that were involved with that to this day mentioned the fact that they remembered the plague of, I think it was plague of 24. It was 24th year after the iteration began. Man, I'm sorry for the visuals. If you're listening to this on podcast, you probably aren't noticing, but the rest of you, if you're watching this video, wondering why the heck I'm mucking about with my eye. The second thing about disease and illness is that you are in total control of it in terms of its vector. So if you want it to only affect a certain number of people, that can happen. If you want it to be rampant and going to affect the whole world, then that's you're adding a level of intensity to the player's experience. But either which way, by having them have to deal with the tending and the treatment and eventually the overcoming of the disease, it makes for some very divergent storylines from what the norm would be. 3. The third one we're going to talk about is the idea of weather and precipitation. And while most adventures happen on bright sunny days with lovely warm weather, some of the most dynamic of adventures have been ones where the party is trying to cross a pass and they have to worry about a weather change, or they're on board a ship and are sailing across the ocean and suddenly have to deal with a gale that blows up and threatens the vessel. The elements of weather that I'm actually talking about in particular in this case are forms of precipitation. It's one thing to be fighting on the deck of a ship. It's something altogether different to be fighting on the deck of a ship awash with seawater and torrential rains and icy sleet. Those forms of precipitation radically change the environment, so that if your vessel is being, for example, assaulted by creatures from the deep, beings of an aquatic nature that are glomming onto the ship and trying to take it over, the fight scenes are going to be way more threatening if there's always a chance of getting washed overboard, and if the footing is difficult to maintain. Granted, there are players who can develop skills that would allow them to alter the weather, but the point here is that they'd have to figure out how to overcome the weather condition, and that won't stop what's already has occurred. So blowing up a squall, causing threats with the changing of the winds and the tide and all of that. We'll get to those in a bit later. But the idea here is even just simply having a simple snowfall is going to interfere with tracking opportunities. It's going to cause difficulties in wrangling, for example, a captured monster if they're trying to transport it from position to position. The idea is that the weather can almost itself take on a bit of a personality. If it's a wind blowing with a vengeance and ripping the players off of a mountainside, that's pretty scary. And weather causes modifications to the conditions of a battlefield. If it's perfectly dry and then starts raining, it'll go from being dry to being wet, obviously. But then, what kind of soil is it? Does the soil become a marsh? Does it become muck? Is it sandy and therefore your feet get stuck and can't be pulled out? There's all kinds of ways in which the precipitation level and the type of weather can really affect the outcome. Even simple things like visibility, and we'll get to that here in a minute. But, pardon me, a blinding snowstorm does reduce your visibility. The brightness of the sun can cause snow blindness. There's so many different ways in which the weather can affect the game that when you're considering what you want to do to spice up your adventure to give it a different flavor, just think about adding weather elements. Now the next one, fog, smoke, and haze, I have found particularly useful, especially when you are dealing with players who are not aware of the numbers of their enemies or their proximity. And so therefore, having fog, smoke, and haze interfere with the ability for the players to see really does require them, therefore, to be more diligent about what they do. Some groups get inventive and utilize sound and actually coordinate their actions. Some use the disguise or the darkness and the smoke to their own benefit, hiding their numbers as well. So the concept of utilizing visual limitations can go anything from a simple inability to recognize friend from foe, all the way to a wall of fog that has virtually impenetrable visual sightlines, so that the players literally are having to stumble into the monsters. This is also particularly good when you're dealing with different theming. If you're doing an adventure in a bog or a swamp, adding in some evening haze and ghost-like strands of miasmic humidity and fog, that stuff adds ambiance to the flavor of the adventure without having to add any conditions. But then if you add the conditions that perhaps the smoke is mixed with the fog, but the smoke has, intoxicants in it, or maybe it causes anoxia. There's all kinds of different ways that the very air that they're breathing can affect their group. Even if it doesn't change the visibility, even if they're able to see, clear in a million, if there are, for some specific reason, pockets of gases, they can interfere with the player's action and cause conditions as well. So, just realizing that your ability to change the game doesn't mean you have to physically alter extreme conditions and simply add nuances really works well. Fourth. No, we're already on to fourth, aren't we? I didn't put up my marker. Doggone it. One of these days I'll get organized. Haha. All right, so next one, I guess we're on 5. Wind, waves, and tides. These certainly matter if you're on board a ship, but if you think about it, if you're along a coastline, it can affect you as well. Perhaps you brought your boat onto shore at the low tide thinking it was high tide, and therefore your vessel might actually drift away. Perhaps the winds are strong enough to interfere with your ability to keep your campfire lit. Maybe there are crashing waves that have battered the house that you're staying in. All of these different methods, I should say, of changing the environment changes the mechanism for the conflict. When you have an increase in activities that are not in the story themselves but are nuanced extra things, you're adding levels of concern, doubt, and fear into the game session, which kind of does heighten the excitement level of it. The last point I have here on this list is crowds and collateral damage. And I don't know very many game masters that would actually entertain what the numbers would be like if a monster attack occurred in a population without any walls, without any defenders, and without any, what the devastation to the structures, devastation to the individuals could be pretty near into catastrophic. So, taking into account the numbers of personnel that the scene might entail adds, again, a different feel and a different nuance to the adventure. If the players are actually literally having to worry about tripping over civilians that got caught by the monster attack in the streets, then their team dynamic might change to rescuing civilians, and therefore they're going to start shunting their engagements to being protective for the population. On the other hand, maybe not, and therefore you have to deal with civilians that get in the way. How do you represent that? Do you have a certain percentage of victimization that occurs so that there are things that the players are going to have to deal with after the fight? Most cases they don't. Most cases the players end up fighting the monster and no civilians in sight, no dangers, no population dangers in sight. But consider what that would be like, even if it's a simple, single farmhouse and the players have been casing it to try to catch the monster in the act, and when they finally do, maybe there's, the wayward son or daughter who happen to go out and look for the creatures themselves suddenly are the ones who are in danger, and so the players have to interact in a nuanced way to save them or to get them out of the risky situation. The idea here is that a interaction with non-enjoined persons, which is my term for NPCs, for those non-enjoined persons to have to deal with whether or not they are in danger adds heavy nuances to the players in their concept of being the heroes. You actually have witnesses to their heroics. You have witnesses to the things that they do in game, and therefore have new stories that return back to town about how wonderful they were. And so you've got new forms of adulation, new forms of indebtedness, for example, that you could bring to play if you took into account the personnel and the people in the area before the actual combat occurred. Having mentioned each of these individually, I really want to talk more broadly now about the concept of nuance, spice, and flavor. As a game master with 50 years of experience, I can tell you don't tell the same story twice. And then immediately upon telling you that, I can also say that NycosRPG's 7-year storyline has been played through a total of 8 times before. And we are now we're now embroiled in that 9th iteration of the story. But that doesn't mean I'm telling the same story over and over again. What it does say is that the triggers for the adventures are reset, and then the players then are advised that the triggers have been reset, and therefore they now know we're at the beginning again. And the direction that the players take the story determine which of the pieces of that large, long tail story happen. Which one happens in what order. But the toolbox of nuances, spices, and flavors literally can make it so that even if they played the exact same module, even if they visited, let's go with a D&D example, even if they visited the Tomb of Horrors, which every player in Dungeons and Dragons, generally speaking, is at least aware, and many of which have lost many characters to. Even in those cases, if you have a broad enough spectrum of nuances, spices, and flavors that you're going to add into the story, they can be indistinct. They would not be. I guess one of the words, they would be indistinguishable. You would not be able to tell the story was the same story, because the methods for interacting change with the conditions, and the more you utilize these condition altering spices and nuances, the more effective your game mastering will be. I have been doing this long enough to know that no two games groups are going to interact with the scene in the same way. So again, even if you had the scene set exactly the same, the players' reactions to things are going to be different enough that they will not be able to tell it was the same scenario as someone else's group. And that's important, because if you're telling stories 3 and 4 times a week for years, you would think you would get burnout. You think you would get tired of the process, or you'd fall into routine and your players would get bored. But if your toolbox, your panoply of having is big enough, that's just simply not going to happen. And so as we come to the end of this episode, I want to thank you for having been here. This has been a 12,000-year tale, 50 years in the making. And if you want to know more about the lore of Nykos, you can check out our data site at NycosRPG.info. If you want to pick up a copy of the Nykos Dark Shards, the actual PDF, you can pick that up at NycosRPG.com. And for more information on our community, and if you want to become a part of that, check out Nykos at patreon.com/Nykos. And the bonus there is that when you are when you are a member of the Nykos Patreon account, you automatically gain access to our Saturday and Sunday live games that we play on Discord. So that's important to note. Now, I didn't mention this at the beginning, so this is a benefit for those of you that have stayed with me to the end. I'm going to put up a prize code here. And you're going to want to keep the keywords for the week. And then on Friday, with the 5 or 6 codes that you've picked up, if you have been able to determine the theme in the Friday show, I'll ask you to email me, and if you email me the proper result, you'll get a free copy of the NycosRPG PDF for the master book. It's not yet been released, and it's in pre-release form, so it doesn't have any graphics, but it'll give you an early jump on a copy of the master book itself, which is they're going to be the basis for the NycosRPG that will be kickstarted a little bit later this year. So Overthruster is the first of the clues. After this, I will only post them. I won't necessarily draw attention to them. But on Fridays, I will ask for someone to be able to tell me what the theme is that the various code words are associated with. This one is going to be arguably the most simple, and therefore, if you already got it, I wouldn't be surprised. And I will look forward to talking about that more on Friday. Until then, thank you for being a participant in today's Creative Differences. These episodes are here Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. Or 11 p.m. We switch up which broadcast we do, but the Creative Differences are generally on Mondays. And with that, we also ship them up to the YouTube channel over at NycosRPG. So we thank you for being here today. We hope to see you next time. And as always, let's keep the dice rolling. Talk to you soon.